Friction is the resistive force encountered when one attempts to move two objects in contact with each other. Exercise devices that use friction as the main source of resistance include belt or brake pad resisted, cycle ergometers, and wrist curl devices. For such devices, Fr equals K times Fs, where Fr is the resistive force, K is the coefficient for friction for the two particular substances in contact, and Fn is the normal force, which presses against each other. The coefficients of friction for initiating and for maintaining movement are different. All else being equal, it takes more force to initiate movement between two surfaces in contact than to maintain previously initiated movement. Thus, a friction-resisted exercise device requires a relatively high force to initiate movement and a relatively constant force after movement has begun. No matter what the movement speed, resistance provided by such devices is sometimes adjusted through a mechanism to alter the normal force that keeps the friction surfaces in contact with each other. A weighted sled used in training for football or track is an example of a device that is resisted by both friction and inertia. The resistance due to the sled's inertia is directly proportional to both the sled's mass and its acceleration. The resistance due to the friction between the sled's runners and the ground is proportional to both the friction coefficient between the surfaces in contact and the net force passing the sled against the ground, which equals the gravitational force minus the upward force exerted by the individual pushing the sled. Mass can be added to the sled to increase the gravitational force. The friction coefficient varies the surface on which the sled rests: sand, soil, bare soil, grass, wet grass, etc. Thus, for outdoor training, such devices do not provide consistent, repeatable resistance. They are nevertheless used in providing horizontal resistance, which cannot be directly provided by weights. It takes more force to get the sled moving than to keep it moving, because the coefficient of static friction is always greater than the coefficient of sliding friction. Once the sled is moving, the coefficient sliding friction stays relatively constant, so that the resistance force does not change even if the speed changes. Fluid resistance. The resistive force encountered by an object moving through a fluid, liquid or gas, or by a fluid moving past or around an object or through an orifice is called fluid resistance. Fluid resistance is a significant factor in such sports activities as swimming, golf, sprint, running, discus throwing, and baseball pitching. Except for swimming, in which the fluid is water, all the others involve air resistance. The phenomenon has become important in resistance training with the advent of hydraulic, liquid, and pneumatic, gas, exercise machines, and with the increasing popularity of swimming pool exercise routines, particularly among older people and pregnant women. The two sources of fluid resistance are surface drag, which results from the friction of a fluid passing around the surface of an object, and form drag, which results in the way in which a fluid presses against the front or rear of an object passing through it. Cross-sectional frontal area has a major effect on form drag. Fluid-resisted exercise machines do not often use cylinders in which a piston forces fluid through an orifice as an exercise movement is performed. The resistive force is greater when a piston is pushed faster, when an orifice is smaller, or when the fluid is more viscous. All else being equal, resistance force is roughly proportional to the velocity of piston movement. Fr equals K times V, where Fr is the resistive force, K is the constant that reflects the physical characteristics of the cylinder and piston, and viscosity of the fluid, and the number, size, shape of the orifice is, and V is the piston velocity relative to the cylinder. Because fluid cylinders provide resistance that increases with speed, they allow rapid acceleration early in the exercise movement and little acceleration after high speed are reached. Movement speed is thus kept within an intermediate range. Although such machines limit changes in velocity to a certain extent, they are not isokinetic, constant speed, as is often claimed. However, some machines have adjustment knobs that allow orifice size to be changed. The larger orifice allows a higher movement of speed to be reached before the fluid resistive force curtails the ability to accelerate. Fluid-resisted machines do not generally provide an eccentric exercise phase, but they may incorporate an internal pump. With a free weight, a muscle group acts concentrically while raising the weight and eccentrically while lowering the weight. With fluid-resisted machines without eccentric resistance, a muscle group acts concentrically while performing the primary exercise movement, and the antagonist muscle group acts concentrically while returning to the starting position. In other words, whereas free weights or weight machines involve alternating concentric and eccentric actions of the same muscle with little or no rest in between, fluid-resisted machines generally involve alternating concentric actions of agonist muscles to groups. Each muscle group rests while the antagonist works. The lack of eccentric muscle action with fluid-resistant machines means that such exercise probably does not provide optimal training for the many sport movements that involve eccentric muscle action, running, jumping, throwing. Elasticity. A number of exercise devices, particularly those designed for home use, have elastic components such as springs or bands. As their source of resistance, the resistance provided by a standard elastic component is proportional to the distance it is stretched. Fr equals K times X, where Fr is the resistive force, K is the constant that reflects the physical characteristics of the elastic component, and X is the distance that the elastic component is stretched beyond the resting length. The most obvious characteristic of elastic resistance is that the more the elastic component is stretched, the greater the resistance. The problem with devices using elastic resistance is that every exercise movement begins with low resistance and ends with high resistance. This is contrary to the force capability patterns of virtually all human muscle groups, which shows a substantial drop-off in force capability towards the end of the range of motion. Another problem with elastic resisted machines is that the adjustability of resistance is usually limited by the number of bands that can be affixed to the device. An effective resistance device must incorporate enough variations in resistive force that the number of repetitions of training can perform is kept within a desirable range. There are products that provide resistance to vertical jumping with elastic bands as a means of developing jumping power. The elastic bands produce little resistance early in the jump. However, when the large muscles exert great force, the bands provide the greatest resistance while the jumper is in the air, where they serve mainly to pull the jumper back to the ground rather than to resist the muscles, and to increase the speed at which the jumper impacts the ground on landing, which may increase the injury risk. Electronically controlled devices. Various resistance training devices are electronically controlled. The actual source of resistance may be one of those previously described or a motor or pump. The distinguishing characteristic of these machines is that they can regulate the degree of resistance during an exercise movement through feedback and control technology. For example, isokinetic dynamometers match resistive force to the muscle force in order to maintain a constant joint's angular velocity. Some devices allow eccentric exercise as well. Other machines control the parameters as power output and acceleration. Negative work and power. Because power equals the product of force and velocity, when force is exerted on a weight in the direction opposite to the one in which the weight is moving, as when a weight is lowered in a controlled manner, calculated power has a negative sign and does calculated work. All such negative power and work occurs during eccentric muscle activity, such as lowering a weight or decreasing at the end of a rapid movement. Strictly speaking, there is no such thing as negative work or power. The term negative work really refers to work performed on rather than by a muscle. When a weight is lifted, muscles perform work on the weight, increasing the weight's potential energy. When the weight is lowered, potential energy is used to perform an equal amount of work on the lifter. Thus, while lifting repetitions are performed, the lifter and weight alternately perform work on each other rather than the lifter alternately performing positive and negative work. The rate at which the repetitions are performed determines the power output. Joint biomechanics concerns in lifting. As with any physical activity, there is a degree of risk involved in resistance training. The risk involved are generally lower than for many other sports and physical conditioning activities. However, rates of injury are the highest for team sports, intermediate for running and aerobics, and lowest for cycling, walking, and weight training, which has about 4 injuries per 1,000 hours of participation. A study of collegiate football players showed that only 0.35 weight training related injuries per 100 players per session. Injuries due to weight training accounted for only 0.74% of the season injuries related time loss of the players. Despite the relatively low risk of weight training, it is desirable to minimize the likelihood of injury through prudent risk management. Following are several factors to consider in avoiding lifting injuries, with particular attention given to the back, shoulders, and knees. The back. In contrast to quadrupeds, whose vertebral columns hang like the cables on a suspension bridge, humans normally stand upright, with the vertebral bones stacked on one on top of another, separated by rubbery discs. The advantage we gain from our upright posture of free use of the arms and hands, accompanied by the disadvantage of having our intervertebral disc under compression force for even when we are merely standing, sitting, walking, or running, and under even more compressive force when we are lifting and carrying. When we are in a standing position, any force we exert with the upper body must be transmitted through the back to the legs and ground. In addition, the back muscles act as a great mechanical disadvantage and must generate forces much greater than the weight of the object lifted. It is for these reasons that the back is particularly vulnerable to injury. Back injury. Back injury can be extremely debilitating, persistent, and difficult to remedy. Thus, every effort should be made to avoid back injury during lifting. The lower back is particularly vulnerable. It has been observed that 85 to 90% of all intervertebral disc herniations occur at the disc between the lower two lumbar vertebrae, L4 and L5, or between the lowest lumbar and the top sacral vertebrae, L5 and S1. This is not surprising given the extremely high compressive forces on the discs during lifting. When a weight is supported in the hands or on the shoulders, the trunk is inclinated forward, where the greater torque about the lower intervertebral disc due to the large horizontal distance between the lower back and the weight. The back muscles operate at an extremely low mechanical advantage because of the perpendicular disc from the line of the action of the spinal erector muscles to the intervertebral disc is much shorter, about 2 inches, than that horizontal distance from the weight to the discs. As a result, the muscles must exert forces that frequently exceed 10 times the weight lifted. These forces act to squeeze the intervertebral disc between the adjacent vertebral bodies and can lead to injury. The flat back lifting posture has been found to be better overall than the rounded, opposite of arched, back in minimizing L5-S1 compression forces and ligament strain. A normal, slightly arched lordotic back has been found to be superior to a rounded back for avoiding injury to vertebral discs, facet joints, ligaments, and muscles of the back. In addition, the low back muscles are capable of exerting considerably higher forces when the back is arched rather than rounded. The vertebral column is naturally S-shaped, being slightly rounded, kyphotic. In the thoracic spine, the lordotic, and the lumbar spine, the wedge shape of the vertebral gives the spine its natural curve. However, the intervertebral discs are flat when the back is in this S shape. When the lower back is rounded, the ventral towards the anterior edge of the vertebral bodies squeeze the front positions of the intervertebral discs. In contrast, extreme arching of the back results in squeezing of the dorsal towards the posterior position of the disc. Such uneven squeezing of the intervertebral disc likely increases the risk of disc rupture. Thus, lifting should generally be performed with a lower back in a moderately arched position. Intra-abdominal pressure and lifting belts. While the diaphragm and the deep muscles of the torso contract, pressure is generated within the abdominal cavity. Because the abdomen is composed mainly of fluid and normally contains very little gas, it is virtually incompressible. The abdominal fluids and tissue kept under pressure by tension surrounded the muscle. Deep abdominal muscles and diaphragm have been described as a fluid ball that aids in supporting the vertebral column during lifting. Such support may significantly reduce both the forces required by the erector spinae muscles to perform a lift and the associated compressive forces on the discs. It is important to note that the Valsalva maneuver is not necessarily necessary for generating an intra-abdominal pressure. In the Valsalva maneuver, the glottis is closed, thus keeping air from escaping the lungs, and the muscles of the abdomen and the ribs cage contract, creating a rigid compartment of fluid in the lower torso and air in the upper torso. An advantage to the Valsalva maneuver is that the increases in rigidity of the entire torso, making it easier to support heavier weights. In heavier lifts, for example, many lifters use the Valsalva maneuver, particularly when the trunk is most inclined forward, near the transition from lowering to lifting. However, pressure in the chest associated with the Valsalva maneuver can have an undesirable side effect, exerting compressive force on the heart, making it more difficult for blood to return to the heart. Also, the Valsalva maneuver can transiently elevate blood pressure to high levels, with the potential risk of blackout. The diaphragm and the abdominal muscles can contract without the glottis being closed, however, creating the fluid ball in the abdomen without pressurizing the chest compartment. This must be regarded as the safest way to add support to the lower spine without building up pressure in the chest, and should be used for most weight training. Building up intra-abdominal pressure without building up chest pressure can be accomplished by consciously keeping the airway open. During a strenuous lift, the abdominal muscles and diaphragm contract reflexively even with the airway open. Lifters, particularly those who compete, may choose the Valsalva maneuver if they recognize and accept the risk involving and have experience to avoid increased pressures to the point of blacking out. Weightlifting belts have been shown to increase intra-abdominal pressure during lifting and are therefore probably effective in improving lifting safety. It has been cautioned, however, that if all lifting is done with a belt, the abdominal muscles that produce the intra-abdominal pressure might not generate training stimulus to develop optimally. It is particularly risky for a person who has become accustomed to wearing a belt to suddenly perform a lift without one, because the abdominal musculature might not be capable of generating enough intra-abdominal pressure to significantly reduce erector spinae muscle forces, and the resulting excessive compressive forces on the disc could increase the chance of back injury. Conservative recommendations are as follows. A weight belt is not needed for exercise that does not directly affect the lower back. For exercises directly stressing the back, refrain from wearing a belt during lighter sets, but wear one for near maximal or maximal sets. The beltless sets allow the deep abdominal muscles, which generate intra-abdominal pressure, to receive a training stimulus without placing excessive compressive forces on the intervertebral discs. Individuals may reasonably choose never to wear lifting belts if they build up strength of their back muscles and the muscles that generate intra-abdominal pressure in a gradual and systematic manner, and if they practice safe lifting technique. Many world-class Olympic weightlifters never wear belts.